All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for making it here to the first session on the first day of DrupalCon. I really didn't know what to expect being put in that presentation slot, if that was going to end up being a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm glad to see so many people in the audience. One of the things that I want to do before I get started is pose a little riddle/quiz to you. Don't shout out your answers, keep it to yourself. I don't know how many of you are site builders in here, or maybe even the Drupal 8 certified site builders, but I want to pose a little question to you. Let's think about that you were in the bathroom this morning, getting ready to get in the shower, and you received a text from one of your colleagues who said, "Oh gee, I noticed your presentation is actually at 8 o'clock today and not at 9 o'clock. What would you do and what would you propose the situation was?" So think about that for a moment, how you would have reacted if you were in that situation this morning, hypothetically speaking. So actually, as you may have guessed, that was not a hypothetical situation. I was right about to hop in the shower at 7 o'clock this morning when I received a text from my colleague, and he told me, "Wow, they changed something here. Your session's at 8 o'clock, not 9 o'clock. And I said, "What?" But then I took a breath and I said, all right, this can't be. No conference is really going to start something at 8 o'clock. How many of you think you know what the situation was here? And how many of you really don't know what was likely going on? Okay, thanks for playing along. So I had to go through a number of steps. I'm going to give you the answer now. But I had to go through a number of steps to regain my composure here, because I'm like, oh my gosh, there's no way I'm getting there in an hour and getting ready to talk. So let me think, what could possibly happen? Long story short, so I don't need too much of the presentation, I asked him, are you signed into the site? And what's your time zone set to? So he was signed into the site, and he still had his time zone set to Central Time. Hence, to him, it looked like the presentation started at 8 rather than starting at 9. So there's a little bit of kind of a practice question for you, for those of you who haven't actually taken the certification exam, a scenario that you might need to work through to figure out, like, what would you do in this situation? So, welcome to Building for Extensibility, a look at Drupal 8's plugin API. I'm Mark Isaacson. I am a Drupal architect and subject matter expert for Accenture Federal Services. I've been programming since 1989, and I've been doing web development since 2010. I've been working with Drupal the whole time that I've been doing web development. And when I first came across Drupal, I have to say, I fell in love with it right away. It's always been kind of an interesting thing to me to hear people talk about how hard Drupal is to understand. I don't get it, it's so difficult. You know, this one is better or that one's better. For me, Drupal just clicked instantly. And one of the things that I think makes Drupal even better now is the way that Drupal 8 is structured and how much more consistent it is and how much easier it is to understand how to use it, because once you understand one of these patterns, that pattern is kind of used in different contexts but with a similar philosophy throughout all of Drupal. So we're going to be looking at one of the things that is used heavily through Drupal, which is the plugin API. Now, a little bit more about myself. My Drupal nick is vegantriathlete, and it is true, in fact, that I'm both a vegan and a triathlete. I've done lots and lots of triathlons, including all the way up through an Ironman distance triathlon. And this is a picture of me having finished the Ironman on my 48th birthday. I mean, it was on August 2nd, of my 48th birthday. So that's what I did for my 48th birthday celebration, is I went and I ran an Ironman distance triathlon, and that's my adorable son with me. I don't do kittens like everybody else likes to put their kitten pictures. I prefer to put my son up here and get the cute effect from having the child there. So today I'm going to talk about the plugin API, and what I am going to focus on is giving you this overview of what are the basic pieces that go into writing a module so that it's pluggable. All right, I don't always build for extensibility, but when I do, I use plugins. Actually, I never said that. I just thought this was, I used a template and I thought that the quote was a really cool slide to use and I wanted to put a quote there. So there you have it. What we're going to be looking through here in the course of this presentation is we're going to kind of step through how you build a plugin. But before we start talking about the plugins, I want to acknowledge the fact that there are other ways that Drupal can be extended. There were other ways that Drupal could be extended before Drupal 8 and the whole plugin API, and those ways are still available with the Drupal 8 plugin API. Once we get through that, we're going to look at how you define your plugin manager. We're going to be looking at annotations specifically. There's different ways that you can do plugins, so we're going to get into using annotations. And then we're going to look at how people know where to put your plugins when we talk about defining the namespace. And then we're going to look at, now that you've got a pluggable system, how do you actually use it and get those plugins that people wrote to be leveraged in your code. And then finally, just really quickly at the end, we're going to look at, so then like, how do people say what plugins they want to use? And we're going to look at one mechanism for doing that, which is using config entities to basically store profiles, and the plugin definitions will be stored that way. So let's launch right into it. So other ways that you can extend your module, make Drupal extensible, is you got things like hooks, alters, and events. Let's take a look at what we're talking about when we think of hooks. What we're looking at here right now is, and I hope that they can still pick this up when I step away, because I hate standing behind the podium. The invoke all method, this is in the module handler service that Drupal provides you. This is pretty much the same way as hooks worked in previous versions of Drupal. If you look through the code there, what you're going to notice is that pretty much what it comes down to is there's a certain pattern that a function needs to be named in, and if your module follows that pattern, Drupal is going to see that that function exists, and then it calls that module. So that's what a hook is all about. It's about creating a function, pattern after a particular name, and then when Drupal hits a certain point in its process, it's going to see any of the modules that have that name, and it's going to call them. So the purpose of hooks is to give you a point in execution where your code can do some stuff. So this is the API on Drupal.org if you wanted to know more about hooks. But the essence of hooks is that it's just a point in the execution, here's your turn to go do something, and then I'm going to go on with the next things that I'm doing. Another way that Drupal gives the capability of extending what your module is doing is through alters. The distinction, and it's a similar type of thing that you're going to do, that you have your function and it's going to be underscore alter, and Drupal's going to pick up the same way. But the distinction between an alter and a hook is that the idea with an alter is that it's going to also be passing an object in to your alter function, and then your alter function has that opportunity to do something with that object and modify it in some way, so that when that calling program gets back from your alter, it's now working with an object that's been modified some way. A hook is more about giving you a chance to go do some stuff on your own. An alter is about giving you a chance to actually affect what happens in the rest of that process with this object that's being used. Okay? And then finally, I want to take a look at the concept of events. This is something that's newly added in Drupal 8 thanks to Symfony. And so what you have with your events, the big key with events is if you look at the method there, that's this dispatch method. That's pretty much what events are all about. To make your module be suitable for use with events, you end up you get the event handler and you call this dispatch method in your module, and then there are other modules that would then write their subscribers or their listeners. So when you're dealing with events, this is from the migrate module, which is it's event enabled. And so here are some of the types of events that the migrate module will use. And darn it, I forgot to pay attention to one of my notes. I did the big red button, and I forgot to thank Kevin Thal for making recordings of all these sessions. So I'm sorry about that, Kevin, but I wanted to thank you publicly for doing all of these recordings and putting all this hard work at the camp. So thank you very much, Kevin. All right, back to the regularly scheduled programming. So there's different types of events that you may fire off. And the idea with an event is that, again, you're going to pass it some type of object that the event subscribers or event listeners could then receive and then do something with that object that's passed to it. So there's events. And you can look at then the way that the events themselves are defined, their classes, and then there are the different things that you put in the classes. So that's the really quick overview and acknowledgement of different ways that you could make your module extensible. But enough about that already. We didn't come here to talk about those things. We came here to talk about the plugin system. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to start talking about Drupal 8 plugins. If you want to learn more about the plugins, there's pretty good documentation on Drupal.org, and it'll give you the overview of the plugin system. So what I'm going to do with this presentation here, I'm going to kind of pick through parts of the documentation and then show you examples of, here's what the documentation says, here's a concrete example of what happens when you do that. So the first thing we're going to look at is defining the service for your plugin manager. This is one of these patterns that Drupal 8 uses a lot, despite the fact that one of my colleagues wanted to argue with me about this other day, Chris. Services are heavily used in Drupal 8. And if you want to write a plugin manager, you need to define a service that Symfony then recognizes as, oh, this is a plugin manager. And so that's what the documentation is highlighting here. They're telling you how to create your service definition. And I do believe, I haven't actually tested this out, many times the way that you name your services is kind of completely arbitrary and up to you. Sometimes the way your service is named actually matters. And I believe that with plugins, this is one of those situations that you notice that your name is actually plugin.manager.archiver. Somebody could double check me on that. I may be totally off base, because like I say, I've never tried naming my plugin managers anything different than that namespace. But if you're trying to write a plugin manager and you're having a problem and it's not working, it might be because you needed to make sure that you named your service according to that pattern there with plugin.manager and then what you were going to name that. Great. So let's see examples of where that's happening. What I'm looking at right now is the core.services.yaml file. Drupal core has a bunch of functionality that's baked in out of the box that you don't have any choice whether you really turn it on or turn it off. And so they've got this core.services YAML file where it names all of the services that Drupal recognizes. It just so happens that the block system is one of these services that's named in the core.services.yaml file. And so you can see the definition right there. It says what class you're going to use. In this case, it's using the default plugin manager to kind of get things rolling, and then it's passing an argument into it. What I'm going to do throughout this presentation is there's 3 modules that I'm going to look at consistently for the most part of the presentation. The block module, which is one of the core's modules that basically it's there, you use it all the time. The aggregator module, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but I chose that one because that's another module that comes with core, but it's one that's actually pretty simple to understand when you look at it. The block system, quite frankly, it's complicated. If you want to become an expert at the plugin API, dig into the block system and look at all the things that it does, because I think the block system probably pretty much hits everything in the plugin API. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the plugin API, the whole way that it was conceptualized and built, was to support Drupal's block system. So I'm assuming that probably most of you have worked with blocks and you're familiar with them, and that's why I decided to use the block module as an example. But at the same time, the block module is kind of a monster to understand everything that it's doing. So what I've also done is I've chosen another module that comes with core, which is the aggregator module, which while you may not have been that familiar with it, it's actually pretty easy to understand when you look at it. So now we're seeing the aggregator modules service.yaml file, which is more typical to what you're going to be doing if you're writing your own custom module. You're going to have your own services YAML file, and then you're going to create the definitions of your services. So again, just recognize the pattern here. We've got our plugin.manager. Some service name that we have. We declare a class to say this is what's going to be running my plugin manager. And then if you look at the arguments that are passed into aggregator, you're going to see that there's some services passed in, and you're going to see that the first thing that gets passed in is actually just this literal string. And when I wrote my pluggable system, I really like this idea that you kind of pass in what plugin manager you're doing. And so are you doing like a fetcher, are you doing a processor, et cetera, because then that's all in that same class. So that's the first argument that you're seeing here for aggregator, is it's basically telling that plugin manager what type of a plugin are you going to be looking at now. And I thought it's a pretty clever way of organizing things. The third example I'm going to look at is a contributed module. And this is the link it module. And I chose this because this is a module that is also pretty popular in Drupal. And so I wanted you to get a chance to see, like, okay, if something isn't part of core, how would you write your own custom module to make it work? And link it gives you a pretty good example of how to go about doing that. But again, what you see is it's the exact same pattern of defining your service here. You've got your plugin.manager, you've got your link it matcher, you've got a class that you define, and this one has a parent that it's using is the default plugin manager, and it's not actually then passing in any arguments into that service because it's basically taking whatever the default plugin manager gets. So that's it for defining a service. I'm not going to dig deeper into exactly what a service is and how you write the service, but that's the services in a nutshell. So at that point, we're ready to now look at these plugin manager classes. That's what we're seeing, for instance, like in the second line there, below the service name definition, it says class, and it says this is my class that I'm going to use for my plugin manager. All right, so we're going to make our way back briefly to the API documentation. We're not going to dig into it too much, but they describe defining your plugin manager class. There's the section here, and what they've actually looked at, if you squinted at the grayed out area, is that they're dealing with the archiver class that Drupal has. Drupal has this ability if you want to create like a zip file or a tar file and stuff like that. So they also give you the ability to plug into that system if you wanted to have your own type of archivers. We don't really care about the archiver module right now. What we're looking at though is that this is another one of the pieces that the documentation lays out is you need to define your plugin manager class. So we'll look at some specific examples now. What does this class look like? It's a pretty simple declaration here that we've got our class, and we'll get to the namespace in a little bit of where this stuff resides, but if you look at the top there, this one's a little different because, again, the block system, the way it's integrated, it sits in like another area of the file structure of Drupal. When we look at aggregator and link it, it's going to be more typical of how you do your custom module. But pretty much all that it takes to get your class defined is you name your class, and then you can extend the default plugin manager. And in this case, this plugin manager for block implements some other interfaces as well, which gives it some methods that it would then be having to define. Let's take a look at the aggregator module and how it defines its class. One thing that you're going to see here as I go through this process is this same pattern. As I look at each thing, I end up giving you 3 examples of it, but pay attention to how each of those 3 examples, they're doing the exact same thing. So if you're going to write your module to be pluggable, look at these examples and you pretty much do the exact same thing, only you put your name in the place where they have their name. So writing pluggable modules is actually more or less a pretty simple process to do. You're going to get into some of your details where you'll need to figure things out, but the overall pieces that you need to put in place, you got a lot that you can look at to figure out how you're going to do yours. So what did the aggregator plugin manager do? It just extended default plugin manager. It didn't implement any interfaces, but it's the same deal. And if you look at the top now, this is more typical of what your module would be like. Your namespace would be like Drupal, your machine name, /plugin. But then again, all you need to do is you declare a class that extends the default plugin manager and you're pretty much good to go. I'm not going to go through line by line in each of these classes to talk about all the things that happen, but if you looked at these classes, you will see, again, they've got pretty similar methods that are inside of it. They're doing pretty similar things inside those methods, and you would be doing those same things when you write your pluggable system. So finally, we'll take a look at the Link It plugin manager class, and by this time, I hope you don't all start falling asleep because it's the same thing as you just saw 2 times before that. You've got a class that extends the plugin manager, and it implements its own particular interface. That's what is meant by defining your plugin manager class. There's a little bit of code that you need to fill in your class that makes it specific to your plugin manager, but mostly what you end up doing there is copy some other plugin manager, and you're going to change a few things within its methods to correspond to what you need in your manager. One of those things that you probably will be changing that's going to work a little bit differently is your annotations that you're going to use. So now we're moving on to the next piece that you're going to work with in your pluggable system, is defining your annotation types. In the documentation on Drupal.org, they mention about that, hey, when you first did your module, you might have used the default plugin annotation, but you really don't want to do that. You probably want to define your own plugin types. So, how do you do that? Well, let's take a look. We're back to the block module. Take a look at the fact that the block module is extending the plugin, and if you look here as well, keeping in mind the fact that because it's a block module, some of its stuff resides in a little bit different namespace than yours would, but if you look at the top, you're going to see it's under this annotation namespace. And so what is the annotation that the block module is defining right now? It's not a trick question. It's easy. The answer's right there in front of you. What type of annotation are we defining? A block. So we're in this annotation namespace. We've got our doc block above there that's saying @annotation, and we are defining a block type of annotation. The block system is a pluggable system, and when you're going to extend the block system, you're going to put something in a particular namespace, and you're going to have an @block annotation in your doc block. So there you go, defining an annotation. You've got something in an annotation namespace, and you just pick the name of your block. What do you think it's going to look like for when we're dealing with the aggregator? Now, recognize there are a few different types of plugins that they're going to do, but take a guess in your head what aggregator is going to look like, and then see if it lines up with what this looks like here. The aggregator module is defining an aggregator fetcher type of annotation. So if you're going to extend the aggregator module, you're going to have in your doc block an @aggregator fetcher annotation definition in the doc block there. And finally, we'll take a look at the Link It module, and granted that you don't know all the types of plugins that Link It has, so you might not know the exact name, but you should expect that the Link It module is going to be pretty similar. So what type of annotation is the Link It module defining here? I don't have my reading glasses on. I can't see it. You guys really need to shout it out. Yeah, this is did I choose a substitution? Yeah. So it's choosing a substitution type of annotation. So that's all there is to defining your own custom annotations for your plugin manager. A lot of this stuff is very simple to do. You don't have to be intimidated by the thought of doing this and, oh, there's all these different names and these different pieces. The actual process of getting it created is pretty darn simple, and a lot of it you're going to be able to find something else that kind of gives you the boilerplate, and then you just change a few things, and then yours is ready to go. Now let's move into defining our plugin namespace. When we write our modules, we put them into certain namespaces with our namespace declaration at the top. When we're creating a pluggable system, we need to tell Drupal where are other people supposed to put their plugins within their module's namespace, the module that they're creating. So this is the namespace that we're talking about now, defining our plugin namespace. So let's take a look at it. When we take a look at the block module, what we can see here is we're calling our parent constructor. That's something you're going to do in your plugin as well, and it's this first argument that you pass into the parent constructor, because again, what we're doing in our plugin manager in our class, we're extending the default plugin manager. So when we call the parent's constructor, we're calling the default plugin manager's constructor function. And what we're doing with that is we're saying, hey, when I'm going to have block plugins, I want them to live inside of the plugin/block namespace. And so we're going to look at an example of that right now to see how the system module is making use of the block plugin API to define one of its plugins. So if you take a look at the namespace that the system module is now using to define its block, you'll see that at the top it's Drupal/system, but then that last part is /plugin/block. The reason it's /plugin/block is that if you remember what we just looked at on the previous slide, is that's what the block module told Drupal it wanted the namespace to be. I want people to put stuff in /plugin/block, and that's exactly what we're doing. And what you'll also notice here is that, as I mentioned, the system module is using an @block annotation to say I'm defining a block plugin right now. And in this situation, we extend the block base, and we implement a container factory plugin interface so that we can inject services in there. But the block that we are defining right now is the system branding block. So if you go into the block layout and you scroll around, actually I guess now in Drupal 8 we don't have any that are not enabled, but if you say to place a block and you get the modal that comes up there and you scroll through that, you would see the system branding block that you can use. So that is the system module leveraging the block module's pluggable system so that it can create a block on the site. What are we going to look at next? The aggregator module. The aggregator module's got to define its namespace. Where are people supposed to put things to leverage my plugin types? So when we look at the aggregator module, one thing that's slightly different with this is that you'll notice when it calls the constructor, it's definitely putting in the plugin namespace. You don't have to put it inside the plugin namespace since you're telling Drupal how to do it, but it would be kind of pathological for you to not put it inside the plugin namespace. Like, follow the pattern that Drupal follows with everything else. So don't get too creative. It puts it in the plugin namespace, and then interestingly enough, it calls it aggregator inside of that, because this just makes sense when people are going to be building things that, oh, I must be building an aggregator plugin. But what's different here is that it passes in this type variable. And where it gets the type variable, this is on account of the fact that the aggregator module passes into its plugin manager the particular, that was that first argument that it put in there. So it's got fetchers, it's got parsers, and it's got processors of the different types that it's going to do. So instead of hard coding plugin aggregator /fetcher, etc., it just passes the variable in. But in essence, it's the same thing that the block module was doing. So let's take a look at a module that is going to be building one of these types of plugins and see how it does it. Well, as I mentioned, the aggregator module has 3 different types of plugins that it recognizes. It recognizes the fetcher, the parser, and the processor. And no, we're not going to look through all 3 of those. I'm not now multiplying the examples that we have that I'm going to just keep beating this into your skulls. So here's the aggregator module defining one of the aggregator plugins. So that's why we have at the top Drupal/aggregator. If you were writing your own custom module to define a plugin for the aggregator module, you would have Drupal /your module machine name /plugin /aggregator and in this case, you're defining a fetcher, and that's why you say \fetcher. So the rest that comes after your machine name is defined by what the aggregator module did in its plugin manager. It told Drupal, I want my plugins to be located at plugin, aggregator, and then fetcher or parser or processor. And so that's what you do. The aggregator module defines its own plugins as well. It's a pluggable system, and it's defined its own plugins, and so it has to follow that same pattern. And then again, you see in this case, it's got the annotation that says aggregator fetcher, and in this case, it's defining a default fetcher type of plugin, and then it's implementing a couple of interfaces here. But that's exactly how you would write a plugin to another module, or somebody would write a plugin to your module. And so finally, we will take a look at link it and see if it does it any differently. What does link it do? Should be no surprise at this point. It's the exact same thing. It calls the parent's constructor and it says, this is my namespace that I want them to put the plugins in. My plugins are going to go in plugin /link it /substitution. Now you will notice here one thing that's different is that in the aggregator module, they named their namespace with a lowercase a for where it goes in. They kind of made it the same as how they did the machine name. In the link it module, they actually made the namespace a capital L in link it, even though the module's machine name is a lowercase l. So this just kind of points out the fact that there's nothing magical about your namespace. You could name it pretty much whatever you want. You want to name it so that it's logical. Honestly, I don't understand why Linkit decided to make it a capital L instead of a lowercase l. But it works. Like, you could do it if you want to. Personally, I like to keep it the same as the machine name is. I think it ties it together better, but whatever, tomato, tomato. It's going to work anyway, whatever you do. So this is the link it module, telling Drupal, I want people to put their plugins in this place. And just as we saw with the aggregator module, the link it module also needs to define its own plugins. So we're going to look at the link it module defining one of its substitution plugins. Same deal as you saw with the aggregator. That you see Drupal /link it, and then you've got the rest of the namespace, plugin /link it /substitution. It's got its annotation, that's the substitution type of annotation, and then, in this case, the way that they're going to define their plugin, they're going to have it extend the plugin base so that you can inherit the pieces from there, and then they'll do whatever else they need because they're implementing the substitution interface, and that interface says, oh, well, that means you also need to do these methods inside of your plugin. Same basic process overall. So we've looked at most of the basic pieces of a plugin right now, and what I want to go into and make clear for you is the fact that I've been talking about annotations a lot here, because what we're looking at is following the method of discovering your plugins with annotations. But that is not the only way that your plugins can be discovered. It's the only way that I've written plugins, because I think it makes sense and it's easy to do it that way. There are 3 other ways that Drupal says that you can also discover plugins. There's a static discovery, the hook discovery, and the YAML discovery. But what we've been looking at in this presentation is this annotated class discovery. So everything we've been doing is all about annotations. We're again back on documentation now on Drupal.org in this whole plugin API section. And so when they're talking about annotated class discovery, when you read some of this stuff, it may seem maybe a little bit kind of like overwhelming or intimidating, but this is why I'm showing you the specific examples of what it looks like when it ends up in code. So when you look through these things here and you see the annotated class discovery, that's what we've been talking about right now. So now that we've seen how we actually define a plugin manager, so we can get these various pieces, we're going to move into how we go about using our plugin manager. And so there's a few methods that we're going to look at that become key to how you use your plugin manager. Back on the documentation on Drupal.org, what we're going to look at is this get definitions method, and we're going to look at this create instance method that you use, because that's pretty much what you're going to end up having to tap into in your plugin manager so that you can use any custom plugins that other people have written to be used by your system. All right. So now we are looking at aggregator and link it from this point. I've chosen to step out of the block world because the block world, as I said, it's way more complicated and way more sophisticated, and I didn't want you to have to look at those examples. So now we're just going to look at aggregator and link it. And you're going to see in the aggregator module here, what it's doing is it's using its plugin manager. There's a particular type. Remember, aggregator has this notion of where it's passing a variable in so that it can use the same code for managing all this stuff. So pretend that we're looking at the plugin manager that's the fetcher type, for instance, there. And then what we're saying is, hey, get all of the definitions. The way that Drupal knows how to get all of those definitions is that it looks in the namespace that the module said people are supposed to put their definitions into. So there's no more of like this function exists type of thing that you need to find. It knows what namespace to find the different plugins in. And that's what get definitions does for you. The plugin API has a lot of work, obviously, that's been done under the covers for you to be able to do all of this stuff. So it works its magic. But when you are going to be trying to get at other people's plugins, one of the things that you're going to need to be able to do is to be able to get the definitions of those plugins. When you know the particular one that you want, then you just use the get definition method, the singular one, and you pass in that particular plugin ID, and now you got access to whatever that plugin does. So that's how you find out the plugins. Let's take a look at the link it module. And the link it module is doing the same thing here. This build rows method, this has to do with one of the forms that that you're going to do to build your profile there. And so it basically needs to find out what are all the definitions, what are all the plugins that I know, so I can present this thing in the form, and you're going to be able to then choose stuff from the form to build this profile. So there's the link it module doing the exact same thing. It's getting the definitions of all of the plugins that any modules have defined, the link it module included. Once you have your definitions of your plugins, at some point you're going to need to use the plugin that was chosen. And that's what this create instance method is about. We're back again in the aggregator module. And so at this point we're in the flow someplace where the aggregator module needs to now use the plugin that's been defined and has been configured wherever it was in the interface to say, oh, this is the plugin I want you to use. So it knows the ID that it wants to be utilizing in there, and it's going to use that create instance method. Once you create that instance of that plugin, now you got access to it, and you have it do whatever it needs to do. Now keep in mind, when you're defining your plugin, you are going to be using certain interfaces perhaps, and so you know what methods are going to be available to you when you're going to be leveraging that plugin. Let's take a look at the link it module, doing the same type of thing here, that it's got this create instance when it's on the form for the matcher here. Because again, we need to give people a choice of like, what plugins do I recognize, so it creates the instance of it. And this is going to move us into the final thing that we're talking about here. Link it uses this concept of profiles. So if you've worked with the link it module on your site, you would see where you go to the configuration page and you need to set up certain profiles. And those profiles are what you end up using when you're dealing with your text formats and what filters are supposed to be applied. So you actually reference the profiles at that point. The way that the link it module does it is by using config entities. And so that's the last thing we're going to look at here, is using a config entity to manage your plugins. And you just about made it through it here, folks. Pretty much you've almost survived. Just hang on there for a few more moments, and you'll have made it through this whole code-heavy presentation. So what the link it module does is it defines this config entity type, and all we really care about that is the fact that what it's doing is it's defining this profile, this concept of a link it profile, because that's how link it allows people to say, which plugins do I want to use in which situation. So you create a profile, and that profile gets saved into this config entity. That's all there really is to using the config entity types as an aid in managing your plugins. So when you're in that form and you have chosen what plugins you're going to put in the profile, all that link it ends up doing is it gets the information from the form that you put there, and it essentially just does a save on that config entity. Now that config entity is available to link it, and then link it then refers to that config entity somewhere later in the process, so that it knows like, oh, I've got this profile, and this profile is being used in this text format, and so now when this text format is being processed, I know I need to grab this substitution match, I need to grab this match, and now I'm going to do my magic when I do my processing of that text area that uses the text format. That took us from beginning to end with all of the pieces that go into making a plugin manager. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. We've got, is this supposed to end at 45? Okay, so if you had questions, I'm happy to take a few moments to answer questions. I didn't hear the question.
Is the session recorded? Yes.
Oh, yes. The question was the session recorded? The answer is yes, the session was recorded.
She said I didn't get it about config entities.
Config entities?
I did not get it about.
Okay, so the question about config entities. You are not necessarily going to use a config entity with your plugin manager, so you don't have to overly stress whether you understand config entities or not. Drupal has different types of things that you will define. You might define actual like content entities, which you can think of in terms of like, if you look at the node module, you've got your different bundles that you can build around the content entity. A config entity is what you use for storing configuration, basically. So it's not a critical piece of doing plugins, but it is a method that you will often use. So getting more into config entities is kind of out of the scope of the detail we'd be here, but that's a rough answer there. Any other questions? Yes?
So when you write your own plugin manager, what step do you start thinking of? What kind of profile people that will like layer into your manager? How do you prepare about defining your profile?
Are you talking about profile as in the config entity putting stuff into profile?
Yes.
So the question was if you are defining your own pluggable system, when you start thinking in terms of like a profile, for instance. So I would say that that is part and parcel of how you go about designing things from the very beginning, because you need to think about, why am I making this a pluggable system, and then how are people going to leverage my pluggable system. If you look at the block system, and I didn't get into how it knows all the stuff, but it's basically all the stuff you're doing in the block layout, that's where it's doing all of its things. That's where you're doing your various configuration there. If you look at the aggregator module, it does it slightly differently. It doesn't give you multiple profiles that you can do. You basically go to one configuration screen and you tell the aggregator module, use this, use this, use this. So there's essentially only one profile. It gets stored in config. If you look at the link it module, it gives you this concept of having as many different profiles as you want, and then those profiles get used when you're doing your configuration of that text filter. So it totally depends on why you're writing a plugin, but that consideration needs to happen right up front. I think I'm going to need to give the next presenter a time to plug in and get comfortable being here. Thank you so much for attending the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.